We have in the studio at ThePrint with us Professor Madhulika Banerjee, a political scientist at Delhi University. Her work on Ayurveda and the different medical systems of India, their relationship with modern medicine, their relationship with politics, which is often not understood in its entirety, is something I have greatly benefited from, and I'm delighted to have her here with us. And today we're going to talk about her new book, that is the Herbal Sutra, Indian Wisdom and Wellness Through 100 Herbs. It's a lovely compilation of 100 herbs, as the title suggests, that are found across the country by different names. They have multiple uses, cosmetically, medicinally, in our diet, even ritually, and so it's the perfect book to keep on our bedside table or in the kitchen, so that one can keep going back to these herbs and what all they offer us. Ma'am, welcome to ThePrint.
Thank you.
I would start off by asking that, this is something that you talk about in the introduction, which I thoroughly enjoyed reading, that our generation and the generations after me, especially in urban areas, I feel are discovering herbs through these packaged bottles and ready to pop pills. Haldi ka pill ho gaya, ye tulsi ka pill ho gaya. So that's what our relationship with herbs has been. Of course, all of them often carry these titles of being grandma's recipe and so on. Do you think this is a good thing for our traditional medical wisdoms, or is it counterproductive?
It's an interesting place to start, Sonia. When things come in bottles, two things we need to understand is what is happening. One, that product is coming to you in isolation. Right? So you see it as haldi or tulsi or whatever else, and you understand its benefits to be like any other pill. The foundation of all herbal medicine, irrespective of the labels you give it or the knowledge systems they come from, is that herbs always work in combination with others. Right? So almost all medicines in these knowledge systems are compound drugs, as they are called. And there's a unique way in which the combination happens. So, in a sense, when things come in separate packages like this, they are actually not representative of the grandma's recipes. No grandma would have used haldi in isolation, right? So, in that sense, it's not in its entirety that you are encountering this wisdom. But given how complex urban life is and the manner in which the market mediates everything that reaches us, it would be foolish not to acknowledge that this is better than it disappearing altogether.
Okay.
But having said that, I think that if you were to think of, so if we are not to have it through tablets and through packaging, how would we do that? A very interesting organization based in Bangalore called the Foundation for the Revitalization of Local Health Traditions has a concept called home herbal gardens.
Okay.
In which they give you a set of 20 or 30 plants that you can even grow, or less, that you can even grow on a narrow balcony in an urban apartment. And they have a little booklet in which they tell you how these herbs work. The beauty about these knowledge systems is that it places you and the herb in the same cosmos. And that you are part of the universe. The universe is also within you.
Yeah.
Right? This link is a very valuable link, and we need to remember that human civilizations until 300-400 years ago, everywhere in the world, were based on this foundation of this deep linkage between human beings and nature, where human beings used nature. But there was a very clear line that divided use and abuse. When you extract herbs like this and transform them into pills, there is a stage in the production process where it borders on abuse.
Correct. Yeah.
So we have to be cognizant of that. And always any point of critique has to be accompanied by a point of an alternative. So I would say that it's easy, it's not that difficult to perpetuate. Lots of people garden,
Yeah.
loads of people have plants. It's not that difficult to train people. And you know, every community in the city is accompanied by hordes of migrants who come fresh from the village.
Correct.
We must remember that our exchange with modern medicine dates back to the colonial period, and we must remember that the colonizers, when they came first to India, what we know as modern medicine today, what I like to call biomedicine, is something that was still evolving. It hadn't come to its present form, even in the early 18th century. So many of the doctors, though, who were from that evolving tradition, who came to India, or even just administrators, were very admiring of the wealth of knowledge, not just the biodiversity, but the wealth of knowledge we had about that biodiversity. So there was a lot of mutual learning at that time. But then slowly over time, when the crown took over, there was a lot of power that came with biomedicine. And a lot of the conflict. And as you said, there's so much, I'm not even a historian, but historians have documented many dimensions of this. And very interesting responses came to that. So some people have called it an encounter, including myself at one point in time. But other historians have studied and said it was not just a kind of acrimonious encounter. There was a lot of adaptation, a lot of give and take between, the different the different knowledge systems. So that changed. But in terms of state power, it was clearly an assertion of biomedicine over and a marginalization of all of these systems that existed in India. Ayurveda, Siddha, Unani, Swarikpa. Though Swarikpa was not exactly in the subcontinent at that time, but yes, there was always, side by side they all existed. Now, over time, unfortunately, that hegemonic position of biomedicine was consolidated. And even though during the anti-colonial struggle, the Ayurvedic Unani physicians created a big body which then participated in the anti-colonial struggle as part of the national identity kind of thing. It's a very interesting story. And as we know, Gandhi was a great supporter of naturopathy.
Correct.
He had issues with Ayurveda, Unani, etc. All that is, complex history. But by and large, the leadership that inherited the post-colonial state power were very concerned that India needs to be at par with everything that modernity stood for. And so in that sense, the dominance of biomedicine was established in the post-colonial health system. And the others, were very much there. But in terms of state support, it was marginal. And there's no doubt that over time, what has happened is that biomedicine's rapid progress in terms of their new discoveries and their medicines and so on has meant that its power has been established. And let's not forget that no knowledge system's power is established simply on the strength of its own perspectives or its merit. If it is accompanied by power in the market. So when its medicines start being produced in the market and being available over the counter, being available cheaply, available anywhere, these are the characteristics of modern pharmaceuticals, which are very, very hard to combat. Of course, the interesting thing is that Ayurveda Unani physicians could see it in the 19th century itself, and that's why we have a lot of modern Ayurvedic manufacturing happening by the end of the 19th century itself. So some of the biggest manufacturers like Kottakkal from Kerala, from your Baidyanath in Jhansi, Charak in Maharashtra, so many.
Or even Hamdard for Unani.
Of course, Hamdard for Unani. these are all, established end of the 19th century, early 20th century. So they could see that this is where the real contestation is going to be. But you see, the difficulty with a lot of modern knowledge, it's not only medicine, but with a lot of modern knowledge, is that the underlying assumption is that all knowledge that existed before it becomes irrelevant. There's a kind of obsolescence in that older knowledge system. So if it is obsolete, then why would you have respect for it? The difficulty is that these are knowledge systems which come from a completely different, I don't know, it's a form of knowledge, epistemology. Its philosophy is very different.
Correct.
So it's not about whether it's old and new knowledge. It's knowledge coming with a different perspective. And so there are different knowledges, and how you know or how you learn Ayurveda, Unani, or for that matter many other knowledge systems, like how to manage water, how do you build materials that you build with, and so on. So these are all knowledges that have existed, of course. They come from a different worldview. They use natural materials in a very different way. They see the relationship between human beings and those natural materials. You don't see them as resources.
That idea of efficacy is also different.
Oh, I was just coming to that. So once you have one kind of relationship, when you're looking at things like as resources, then you build your notion of efficiency on that. And the counterpart in medicine is efficacy. So these are debates that I have written about in my earlier book, which was published in 2009, Power Knowledge Medicine, Ayurvedic Pharmaceuticals at Home and in the World. So in that book is much more focused on pharmaceuticals. But there, in fact, I showed how modern Ayurveda and Ayurvedic practitioners in their wisdom in trying to deal with, the power of the modern pharmaceutical, and in trying to retain some space in this new medical knowledge market, and believing that if they were to do things similar to that of the modern pharmaceutical, then Ayurvedic medicines, Unani medicines, they would survive. And so they cast their production of medicines into the frame. Very many things were similar. So they're trying to emulate. Now, what I've called in my earlier book, they cast themselves as a double rather than remaining as the other, trying to imitate. It has had its advantages. Let's not forget that so much of Ayurvedic medicine that's available in the market today, for those of us who still want to exercise that option, it is there because they managed to produce it like this. There's no question. But it's a toss-up, it's a difficult thing. And the beauty of many of these pharmaceutical companies is that they are still advised by, sometimes headed by, people with that vision who feel that they need to strike that balance between retaining the form and the content and the rigor of those medicines, together with what can effectively sell in the market. So it's a difficult space. And just answer the last question, which is about, the relationship. So to go back to that point, where if you come from a knowledge system where everything that came before is obsolete, you are not taught really to respect. What I find particularly sad is that a lot of biomedical doctors have an opinion in which they are not very respectful, which is actually not based on knowledge about those systems. They are actually ignorant when they say, oh, homeopathy doesn't work.
It's an ideological opposition.
It's an ideological, and come to think of it, for a scientific enterprise, isn't that very odd? Because if you are a scientific person, the first thing you would want to know is, what is this about? How does it work? Then you make up your mind, and that's a totally fair position. But in fact, most doctors don't have any idea. And that I find it. My father, who was a surgeon, and of course trained in the biomedical tradition, but as a young person, his father advised him to go work for a Hakim. We had a Hakim in the family, and this is the interesting thing, that we are a upper caste Hindu family, but one of the healers in the family. He was a Hakim. He was not a Ved. So he said, "Why don't you go work with our Hakimji for a while, at least to learn something different." And that instilled in my father a respect for these knowledge systems, even when he didn't know, of course, very much about them. And whenever he had an opportunity, he would then try to learn from them and to see the complementarity rather than the conflict. So this is also possible. It's not been a very respectful relationship, to give you a direct answer. But there are also unevennesses in that relationship, is also what I would like to.
And I'll now move to the title of your book, which is the Herbal Sutra, Indian Wisdom and Wellness Through 100 Herbs. Now, I want you to unpack for the viewer what you mean by Indian here, because I see, even if you just go on Twitter, if you read up the tweets on Ayurveda, for example, we see very different kind of responses, almost polar opposite responses. One, I feel, is obviously this kind of exoticization that happens. So there are Ayurvedic spas and retreats, which most people can't afford anyway, but they exist. And then there's this kind of romanticization that Ayurveda is, we kind of knew everything, and modern medicine is just sort of a retrospective response to Ayurveda. And then what you were talking about, this kind of disdainful dismissal of Ayurveda or any kind of traditional medical system as a whole, as though it's just quackery. So what do you identify as Indian system of wellness and healing?
I think the elementary thing that we need to understand when we say Indian is that it's an ecological region in which there are many, many ecological sub-regions as well, right? And all of the knowledge that we either call Ayurveda or Unani, Siddha, any of these local traditions, they are principally knowledge about that local ecology and what is available locally in nature, whether it is in plants or animals, and how that can be used to either maintain health, Ayurveda as in science of life, etc., or to deal with disease. So when I say in my book, the title is Indian Herbs, what I'm talking about is a combination of ecologies that we call India. So, and increasingly, when you look at the debates of the climate crisis and so on, primarily we need to understand that knowledge can have universal attributes as science claims. And when we say science with a capital S, right, dominant modern science claims, yes, it can have universal attributes, no question. Gravity works the same everywhere, etc. But nature is so diverse, and that diversity becomes a fundamental element in contextualizing knowledge. Now, even in the medical knowledge systems that have evolved here, you will see that there is an interesting play between certain kinds of universalities that they have. So they have, even though the spelling out may be different, but there are common notions of balance, of the different humors from the Greek tradition. That's the word we use, but we call them doshas and we call them all kinds of we have other categories. But the idea is that so we have a common, sort of, it's a common, what Kaviraj calls a common circle of intelligibility, right? So there are these common concepts, but when these common concepts are applied to the natural ecological context that you live in, then it needs to be translated in different ways because all of these medical knowledge systems actually believe that your body is a product of the ecology where you grew up. So if you grew up in the desert,
Yeah.
the same body but will have a different set of combinations of factors, to put it very in a common language,
Yeah.
rather than if you grew up near the sea. So the physician needs to know that and address that part of the. So that is what I am trying to draw on when I say Indian. And what I tried to do, we needed to keep the format in the 100 herbs alphabetically, etc. So what I did was to pick the herbs that identified a range of ecologies, because that's also to respond to this notion of Indianness that you're talking about gets hyped up on Twitter. I mean, I think that's the reason why I'm not on Twitter. I can't bear the level and the kind of conversation. They make me very agitated. But that's precisely why. Because, when we say Indian, fundamentally we have to understand that we are a product of this ecological diversity.
But it's both sides. It's not just one side. It's both sides kind of going after each other with one, as though there are two sides, which is
that's exactly
too much to assume anyway. That there is one side that so-called supports modern medicine, and then there would be the Ayurvedists. And
Sanya, the thing is that in this entire debate on what is Indian, what constitutes Indian, and the tradition and so on and so forth, two things. Just too directly, because we can't talk endlessly about this. The fundamental thing is that the knowledge that is there in these knowledge systems is not something that was congealed 3,000 years ago. There are texts from that far back, yes. But the beauty of these knowledge systems is that they have constantly evolved. There have been, if you're going to simply talk about the textual tradition, they have evolved through commentaries, and the commentaries are still being written. And what are commentaries? That this is what we understand from the text. But when I'm practicing, I find this, and this. These are the variations, these are the interesting things, this is how I've adapted. And the beauty is that these are knowledge systems across the spectrum of what is known as Ayush. They are evolving systems. So to even make a claim that we knew everything and so on is just simply not true. And not true not because, we didn't have a glorious past, but the point is that it was not in the past. It's the contemporary, it's the present. Yes, maligned and so on and so forth, and not supported enough, true. But these are knowledge systems that, have survived despite the state in many places. So we need to first of all understand that this glorious past of Indian knowledge systems is actually unfair to the Indian knowledge systems. That's an unfair representation of them. They are contemporary live traditions. About opposing fiercely, you see what happens is that any position of power, if you take a position of power, it's actually so futile, because you're leaving yourself devoid of a complex set of inputs that can come from many different sources of knowledge. And to take this high ground that this is knowledge and nothing else, it's just, historically, that's the problem.
Unscientific, as they
It's very unscientific, and historically it has never stood the test of time. So those who make these kinds of assertions have to think the problem is that when you study medicine, unfortunately, the way our knowledge system institutions are structured, you stop studying history at the age of 13, in class 8. After that, you're only doing science, as if, that's all that makes sense. So that's a very big problem, that those who make these assertions on behalf of biomedicine are being unfair. And also, I might quickly point out that that's not, fortunately, the Twitter representatives are not all there is to it. There are nuances, there are huge spaces of conversations. I once wrote a paper called Conversations Between Biomedicine and Ayurveda. About 10 years ago, in which I documented through the lives of 3 physicians in India, as to the kinds of conversations that they have carried out and the beautiful work they have produced as a result, in which the 2 knowledge systems, biomedicine and Ayurveda, or there must be others, but these were all Ayurvedic practitioners, how they have evolved, and they've created wonderful work in this country from physicians who do not take these kind of hard positions. And I think that these debates are very unfair to them because they have worked so hard to create these very complex nuances. And I think we need to pay attention to them. Really.
I want to move now to a political question, and I'm glad you mentioned about the colonial encounter and how the encounter between biomedicine and traditional forms of medicine, because for some reason it's only traditional forms of medicine like Ayurveda, Unani that always take the burden of being political, and as though biomedicine is not political at all. But having said that, I want to ask you that there has been, over the last 10 years, a concerted push by the government to sort of promote Ayurveda. How do you see this push, and what do you make of it? And why is the idea of Ayurveda in particular so closely linked with the idea of the nation, and especially given the context of this government, which is a very nationalistic government? So for them, Ayurveda is also very important. What is the relationship between nationalism and Ayurveda?
So, if I take your first question first, see, Sanya, the space of Ayush, I wouldn't say just Ayurveda, but the space of Ayush itself is a very complex space. There are those in Ayush who want to replicate everything that knowledge stands for in the parameters of biomedicine, because that's the hegemonic parameters. That's the dominant. So, when you identify a disease what do I mean by this? You identify a disease condition, you must have a tested, efficacious medicine for it. You give the medicine, and the patient should be okay. But this is not the parameter by which many of these knowledge systems work. There are many other parameters, most people are familiar. Now, there are many others who have tried to actually negotiate between the parameters to see that, okay, with changing life situations and so on, how can these knowledge systems adapt without losing sight of their very deep and valuable epistemology, their worldviews. And there's a third who are most interested in making medicines for the market. Now, you see, the first and the third are most easy to handle for a state, because they work within parameters that are familiar, because everything else works within those parameters.
Yeah, correct.
So, whether it's the market or whether it's science of a certain kind, to just crudely put two labels to it. The one in between is the one that will last. And if, as a government, you have the tenacity and the strength to understand that, okay, yes, we need to support the first and the third, but the second is who we should systematically support and promote, because that's what's going to. Now, ultimately, it's medical knowledge. It's not about this label or that. It's medical knowledge, human beings, health, wellness, sickness. That has to be. So, if you're farsighted politically, then you would promote that tenaciously. I am not sure that this balance is being maintained. In the push to Ayush, because let's not forget the market is overwhelming, and let's not forget that those who go by the dominant paradigm of illness, wellness, etc., they also are dominant. In the market, it's not only those who make medicines, but those who are trying to cast Ayurveda into forms that are viable in the market. Ayurvedic tourism, spas, etc., that you talked about earlier. So, it's easy, it's attractive. We have to understand that they are limited. And that's why, if you're doing politics, you should also study history.
The relationship between how is
nationhood,
Ayurveda so interlinked with the idea of the nation? Why is it so important for someone who calls himself or herself a nationalist?
See, the thing is that nationalism is something that binds you to your ground. Fundamentally. Unfortunately, I would say that nationalism, as the idea that came from Europe, is also an idea that not only binds you to the ground, but also then has identified one kind of identity that binds you to the ground, or that is acceptable
Yeah.
as an identity that comes from this ground. Ayurveda, literally and otherwise, metaphorically, is something that comes from our ground. As I said, it's an ecologically driven knowledge system, as are many of all of the others actually. So, in that sense, there's no question that that gives you a very solid foundation. Yes, my identity is linked to this ground.